Hi, and welcome to today's SPE Live. We are talking intelligent water management, specifically produced water management, and shortly we'll be meeting our expert guests from B3 Insight. Water, of course, is a precious resource, and all too often we are far too complacent about its availability and quality. So well demonstrated recently in Texas this week, reported 12 million people with little or no water due to winter storms. As many of you know, massive volumes of water are co-produced with oil and gas in unconventional plays in US land operations. Similarly, in other developing unconventional plays, such as the Vaca Muerta in Argentina. Some of the water is reused and recycled for field operations. Most is re-injected subsurface for disposal. So how do we make better and more intelligent, sustainable operational and business decisions around produced water? This is today's theme. My name is Nils Kaageson-Loe, and it's my pleasure to be your host for today. And if you're new to SPE Live, check us out on social media, #SPE Live, or find us on SPE.org. And that includes our collection of past broadcasts. These are all available for you to watch at your leisure and convenience. So check it all out on the SPE Live content from 2020 and all the content so far in 2021. All for free, so all for your pleasure and entertainment and education. Now, let us meet our experts today. It is my great pleasure to introduce Kelly Bennett, CEO and co-founder of B3 Insight. Kelly has spent his career making obscure natural resource and commodity data usable for high-value decision-making. Prior to B3 Insight, he built the global energy desk at Bennett Energy, which is now Platts, and co-founded Ponderosa Energy, an oil and gas market analytics company acquired by Envirus in 2016. He is a member of the advisory board for the Internet of Water at Duke University's Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions, and a key contributor to the Aspen Institute Dialogue series on water data. Also a board member for the nonprofit Western Landowners Alliance, and an active volunteer with Colorado Uplift, a nonprofit program to engage in long-term life-changing relationships with urban youth. Joining him is his colleague, Dr. Robert Bruant, Director of Product at B3 Insight. Rob has a long and rich career in a variety of roles for BP and Pioneer Natural Resources, including Strategy Manager, Subsurface Manager, Reservoir Engineer, and Petroleum Systems Analyst. He serves on the Board of Directors for the Produced Water Society, the Dallas section of SPE, contributes as the membership chairpersons for SPE's Carbon Capture, Utilization and Sequestration, or CCUS, technical section. And among many academic and professional accreditations, Rob holds a PhD in hydrology from the University of Arizona, very useful in terms of water management. Kelly, Rob, a very warm welcome to SPE Live. A very timely discussion in many ways, given circumstances in Texas, and also in the southern US. Just a reminder to our audience, fingers on buzzers and keyboards. Now is an excellent opportunity for you to ask questions about produced water management and how we can better our industry and business practices around that, particularly data management and data analytics tied to water management. So, Kelly, Rob, perhaps kick us off by painting a picture of the produced water management landscape here in the US, particularly US land operations. Kelly, I'll let you take it from there.
Sure. Nils, thanks again for the opportunity to participate in these programs. They're really excellent, and we are really grateful for the opportunity to join you. Water management is a sort of a nascent new sector or sub-industry in oil and gas that has grown really significantly over the last several years. It's not new. I think that over the last probably 3 years, there has been a level of interest from institutional investors to really help it mature into more of a midstream kind of industry. And so, especially with some of the issues in the Permian, where you have some areas that are producing 8, sometimes, including flowback 12 times more water than oil, you have really found, the industry has really found itself needing large-scale, landscape-scale solutions for water management, and that's created an incredible need and opportunity to develop really a new industry.
Thanks, Kelly. Rob, do you want to add to that? You have a lot of experience building out midstream water management, particularly in the US.
Absolutely. And I mean, I absolutely second what Kelly has said. It is a process that's been going on for a while, but in terms of a coherent industry around water management, it's still rather nascent. In previous roles that I've held prior to B3, one of the challenges has always been access to accurate and usable data. That is not lost on this water management industry. Good data, good information makes good decisions. And that's one of the big reasons that I joined B3. And our primary focus is to bring transparency and understanding to this new industry that still remains a little bit opaque with regards to utilization and access to data.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Can one of you sort of just give us the magnitude of the volume of waters that we're dealing with? Kelly, you mentioned 12 times more water than oil and gas. So, and it's a young industry, as you both mentioned. So give us a little bit more detail around the volumes that we've over what land area, because this is a significant industry, right? It's the young midstream industry, so it's there for a reason.
Right. So I actually have a few slides that I have prepared, and so I will pull one of them up here. One of the things that we like to do is really interrogate our data a lot. So I would say that we are actually the largest power user of our own data for internal analytics projects. And one of the things that we did is worked with our partners at Enverus to make a projection of sort of a high and low case. We worked with the market analytics team at Enverus, a group of our customers who were really focused on understanding the sort of overall magnitude of the water management challenge in the Permian alone, and built some production forecasts over the next decade to look at a high and low case scenario. Now, these were built before the downturn. These were built before last year, but it still gives you a really good sense of the magnitude of the challenge here. So what we did, just to sort of set the table for understanding what water management needs were going to be over time, was take our high-level produced water forecast and assume that every well that was drilled over that forecast period was completed. All the hydraulic fracturing happened with 100% recycled water. So any barrel of water that was produced that could be reused was reused. And what we ended up with was this overhang that you can see every year growing to over 8.3 billion barrels a year of excess water just in the Permian. So knowing that recycling is nowhere near that number right now, that just gives you a sense of how much water is going to have to be managed. Right now, that's primarily disposal. There are plenty of other initiatives right now, some of them being facilitated even by some policy that is coming out of states like New Mexico to really force the industry to reuse more, to explore different kinds of treatment, and even to potentially set the table for a longer term discussion about subsequent beneficial reuse of treated water from the oil field. But it's a tremendous amount of water.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just for the audience there, the scale here is billions barrel per year, right? So this is a very, very significant volume of water. Kelly, you mentioned sort of like how some of the state regulations can impact water management decisions. I think we can cover that a little later. Just to touch again, maybe Rob, you can come in here. So for people to understand the difficulties in recycling some of this water, you mentioned that some of the water is recycled, but there's a big overhang. So why is that big overhang there? Why can we not reuse so much of this water?
Well, a lot of it has to do with the actual quality of the water that is co-produced with the oil and gas. We're talking about water here that is rather laden with salts, with naturally occurring organic material, organic compounds that can exist in concentrations greater than 100,000 parts per million total dissolved solids. That's 10% of that volume, which is solid material that comes out of the ground. So the recycling becomes a challenge due to the waste product associated with that recycling activity. What do you do with the solid material that is residual to recycling? So it's one of those additional hurdles that we have to face with regards to learning how to use this water both internally within the industry and potentially outside of it.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. So that's a really good sort of information for the audience there in terms of the difficulties and the salinity of this water. Let's turn a little bit more to what you guys do in B3. So Kelly, you made a career out of creating value from natural resource and commodity data. So produced water in unconventional operations, it's either a resource, as we just mentioned, or it's a nuisance given its salinity. So what is B3 Insight's value proposition? Why are you here in this space?
Yeah, so what we're doing at B3 is building the definitive source of data and analytics for water. So we focus on oil and gas right now. We also actually support a number of other industries, some of them with oil and gas data to help them understand what's actually happening in this industry. But as we sit and look at just that chart that I showed, the amount of water that has to get managed is really significant. One of the things that has really intrigued us, and I think that is driving some really good behaviors and cultural changes within the industry, is that when you start looking at that magnitude of water, when you start realizing that the where matters, because that's an average for the entire Permian Basin. Some of those volumes are highly concentrated in relatively small areas where they have superior production economics and where we think most oil will be made as a result. You start realizing that the decision-making tools that are out there for the industry to really optimize the way that it manages water is that they're really lacking. And fundamental to that is being able to understand concretely with real data what's happening not only in your operations, but proximal to your operations. Water is a different beast because when you look at water management in the oil field, it's not just about, well, okay, what's my horsepower and how much steel can I get in the ground to evacuate this water to different areas. When you start injecting water in different formations, when that happens at a fast pace with a lot of volume, in relatively small areas or focused areas, you start creating changes in pressure dynamics and subsurface structures. And so you start having really, we like to call them landscape scale issues that are created by individual actors sort of managing their own resource issues. And the data about that and the tools that you need to understand the implications of that on your operations today and in the future are really significant. So that's been the focus of what we do. We like to take an issue like water in the oil and gas industry and understand the life cycle of that water, and then be able to build comprehensive data tools and broader data sets to help people understand each part of that life cycle. Because again, with water in particular, it's not just what you do, it's what all of your neighbors, all of your offset operators are doing. It will affect you, if not today, probably tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really understanding that, as you say, that water life cycle management, and given where water is produced and where it's needed isn't often the same location necessarily. Rob, do you want to sort of add some more detail around that, particularly again, in terms of the resource management and understanding what maybe competitors and, as Kelly said, proximal operations are doing next to your particular operation?
Yeah, I mean, no question about it, as Kelly said. I mean, local issues can quickly and easily become landscape issues. And it's not just speculation in this regard. I mean, we see the physical manifestation of kind of maybe overutilization of this resource. And when I say resource, it's pore space. It's the availability of space in the ground to accommodate all these or these large volumes of disposed water. So some of the physical manifestations of injection, of disposal, are increased pressures in the subsurface that potentially interfere with drilling new oil and gas wells. Or probably even more on the minds of the general public is the uptick in seismic activity that's occurred that for all intents and purposes seems to be very well correlated with the increased volumes and rates of water injection in the basin. I actually think that Kelly might have a demonstration or a video that kind of talks to how not only the frequency of seismic activity is increasing, but also the spatial effects of that seismic activity is growing in the Permian Basin. And yeah, perfect. So as we can see here, that tracking seismic events really above magnitude 2.0, which is a reasonably large event, at least one that can be monitored quite easily with routine seismic arrays. And we see this rather significant upward trending number of seismic events starting from 2017 and going through the end of 2020, really not abating at all. It is the thing that garners and draws a lot of public attention, and no one likes an earthquake in their backyard. Another image we have here that shows a little bit of this time lapse of the spatial area being affected by these earthquakes, just growing and growing as time proceeds and more injection occurs within the Permian Basin.
Yeah, that's excellent, Rob. I mean, not only does it demonstrate this data here that you have, and not only does it demonstrate the limitations on where water can be injected, because states actually regulate injection activity, from what I understand, based on seismic activity, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it has significant implications in terms of not only the kind of the operational characteristics of an oil and gas company, but also really kind of license to operate and regulatory license to operate. No question about it that state regulators are very interested and make permitting decisions based on proximity of seismic events to new water disposal wells in the area.
I'm guessing. Please, Kelly. Yeah, go.
I was just going to add to that. There are also a host of new requirements that are being added to operations seeking capacity in these areas. So, you see roughly 30% of new permits that are being approved with some kind of reduction in capacity or a required compliance with new monitoring requirements. Some of those requirements are not non-trivial. So, having to install an entirely new seismic array, collect data, engineer an earthquake response plan, demonstrate all of that. And what we know is that most of those costs right now are being borne by the permit owner, or the permit applicant themselves. And that means that the economics of those wells is somewhat degraded or challenged is really what I should say. And so you're starting to see some places where it's a legal process to apply for a permit. So there's a notice period, there's a hearing period. Different stakeholders can object and protest these new wells. And one of the new objections that you're starting to see is, well, look at this area. There is already a bunch of capacity that is underutilized. We do not need any more capacity in this area. And one of the things driving that is this desire to avoid overcrowding and overutilization of some of the aquifer structures or that pore space that could end up resulting in increased seismic activity, and the regulators then coming into all stakeholders and saying, well, each one of you now has to install these arrays, each one of you now has to collect daily data, each one of you now has to build and maintain response plans.
Yeah, absolutely. So, this has been the conundrum now. the seismic activity is related to the disposal of wastewater is what's given unconventional such a bad name, particularly in other regions. I'm thinking Europe, where it currently faces a ban. There was a big discussion in Australia. There's been some discussion in Argentina and Colombia, for example, in terms of seismic activity and water disposal. And just to sort of help catch some of the audience up, the reason we dispose of so much water is that one, there is so much water, and two, it's so saline, it's very difficult to treat back to fresh water. So now, unconventional is relatively new technology. It dates back, 10, 15 years in terms of its large-scale development. Midstream water management, a newer industry. Have you seen any improvements in water management disposal related to better oversight of activity and seismic activity, water disposal capacity? Are you seeing an emergence of better management decisions?
I would absolutely say yes. As mentioned previously, one of the issues has always been the concern around, for lack of a better term, stranded assets, or the fact that in one location you might have significant potential for oil and gas development, and therefore significant potential for water production, yet you don't have the resources in place to potentially dispose of that water, which therefore inhibits the ability to produce the oil and gas. So what midstream is providing for situations like that is a connection between points of water production and points of either water use or disposal. Another thing that midstream is significantly helping out with is another thing that was mentioned, which is more efficient utilization of resources. Often oil and gas operators install disposal wells to accommodate what they expect to be peak water production. And once that peak water production passes in an area, a lot of those wells are somewhat negligibly used. The amount of water going in is only a fraction of what they're permitted for. So what water midstream does is allow for more efficient of that iron that's or more efficient use of that iron that's in place, and therefore just overall increase in the amount of utilization of in-place resources. And then just one final point to be made about midstream. I really would say that it's the midstream companies that are driving a lot of the effort on recycling and reuse technologies that we see making significant impacts in the amount of water that does ultimately get disposed.
Yeah, I think the way that midstream has consolidated certain parts of the Permian from an infrastructure standpoint is really important. A lot of those companies are not built on a greenfield venture. They are built on some cornerstone assets that they acquire from producers who become their long-term customers. And there are a number of companies that have done that in a way that allows them to build a really important backbone infrastructure that creates a much more efficient use of disposal resources. It will create a much more efficient way to deliver treated recycled water back into the oil field. And when you talk about whether that's ESG goals, safety issues, just getting trucks off of the road in certain areas, I would love to know how many trucks would be driving through downtown Midland today had you not had an incredible amount of risk taken to develop some of the more significant water midstream operations that exist around it now.
Yeah, that's a really critical point you bring out there, Kelly, in terms of that risk-taking and building out the infrastructure, the midstream infrastructure to deal with this volume of water. And as you mentioned, I'm guessing it's based on data availability, as you both mentioned, is that the more data that's available, the better decision-making can be made. So in addition to some of the data you've already shown us in terms of seismic activity, water volumes, can you say a little bit more about, are you tracking, for example, water quality, different types of salinity, so that midstream companies can make decisions, and also operators as well, as sort of, if I need some water for a frac job, where can I source that water from, for example?
So, like everything that it seems we deal with, there's different levels of sophistication in this kind of burgeoning industry. One of the areas that we have seen recent growth and more contribution to is this point around water quality, and the associated data around it. So we are working with public and private entities to consolidate more and more water quality data. So in fact, that we can help with understanding the water quality distribution, because we know that water quality is very much a spatial phenomenon. It varies kind of laterally throughout the basins that we work in, but it's also affected by the formations that oil and gas producers are producing from. So having a good 3D representation of water quality is important to particularly those midstream operators that, yes, have to manage the chemicals, and also the oil and gas operators that also have to manage chemicals for hydraulic fracturing. They would like to have a little bit more of a heads up as this reused water approaches their sites, so that they can treat accordingly.
Thanks, Rob. Just to build, I'm going to bring in a question here from the audience. So James Johnson's asking any comments on water chemistry composition and how that may affect permit applications. So really building on what you just said there, Rob. So from your experience and view across the marketplace, are you seeing pressures from the regulators as well as operators and service companies in wanting more information about water quality and relative disposal and reuse?
I can say something, and I'm sure Kelly can add to this. No question about the fact that regulators are looking for more information in this regard. In New Mexico, there are now requirements for operators to actually provide information around water quality with regards to the water that is being used for hydraulic fracturing. So that is a new initiative. The database is slowly being built, but absolutely more and more information is being requested to understand this water quality distribution. And I think a large part of it is driven by a willingness and a desire to protect those water resources that potentially have benefit outside of the oil and gas industry, particularly freshwater resources. So more and more scrutiny is being placed on oil and gas operators with regards to their freshwater utilization with regards to their operations.
That makes a lot of sense. Kelly, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. I would say that's more the case on the sourcing side than any kind of disposal program. Right. I haven't ever encountered regulatory concerns about water quality in disposal, as long as it meets Class 2 specifications. But there is a big concern about even what natural brackish aquifers could hold for future supply. Texas made a very significant, multi-billion-dollar long-term investment in understanding its brackish and saline aquifer systems. New Mexico is really forcing companies to talk about the disposition of the water that they're using in hydraulic fracturing, to understand and expose, I think, in some ways, or shine a light on water use. And so that is a big factor shaping the industry looking forward, because the reality is we have a lot of population growth in areas that are natural deserts. And so even water resources that maybe 5 years ago we would have said would never be used for human consumption, agriculture or otherwise, because they have a higher TDS, substandard drinking water today, are really being considered protectable waters of the states in a more significant way now. as regulators, as state legislatures look forward and try to figure out how they're going to tackle longer-term water shortage in the Southwest.
Yeah, Kelly, that's a really great point that you bring up there. I'll turn to that very shortly in a little bit more depth in terms of ESG and how we as an industry can move forward and sort of help improve the sustainability and impact of our operations. Before we turn away from disposal, I just want to pick up one more question from the audience. So earlier, Kath Chohan on YouTube asked a question about wells can be a solution for treating produced effluent. I think it's essentially talking about how disposal wells and the pressure around disposal wells can influence other injection wells in the proximity of that disposal well. So what I'm guessing I'm trying to ask the question is, based on your data, can you see how or inform operators and service companies about how disposal wells and pressures associated with those influence nearby operations and that sort of thing? Can you make that integration with the data?
Absolutely. I mean, we spent a lot of time and effort actually modeling this particular phenomenon, there is not only modeled evidence for this. There's real life evidence that the ongoing injection of fluids is causing an elevation of pressure surrounding those wells, which from an oil and gas producer's perspective, again, becomes very important because oftentimes, at least in the Permian Basin, water gets injected into formations more shallow than the main producing horizons. And what that therefore means is that oil and gas operators and producers have to drill through this zone that is getting pressured by water disposal before they get to the oil and gas resources. And that has led to a host of problems associated with drilling and completion, increased drilling times, more casing strings required to kind of combat that elevated pressure. So it is no doubt affecting kind of the operational characteristics of drilling and completing a well, but also the costs associated with doing so.
Right, and that's a really important thing to think about. And then that's part of why the data that we put together is so important for these companies. When you are going to go out and drill a new oil well, you really need to understand all of those dynamics because they really are tracks that can be out just over the horizon that you're unaware of. And if it means that you have a rig on site for a day or two longer, all of those things start to really have a cumulative effect on the economics of your oil well. And that's just something that we think is more mitigatable and through better optimization using data.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm just going to add one point, and it might be something that we are coming to here shortly, but it also is around communication among operators. There's a lot that can be actually done with more effective kind of sharing of operational information and data that can help mitigate some of these concerns. So alerting other operators in an area when an oil and gas well or wells might be ready to be drilled, so that maybe water injection can be diverted to another location or kind of choked back. There are options here that potentially can help the localized pressure effects that we see around disposal wells.
Thanks, Rob. That's an excellent segue into the next question I was going to ask you. So that in terms of integration, cooperation within the industry, so we've talked a lot about produced water management, which is largely seen as midstream, but it impacts upstream operators, service companies. So tell us about the Oilfield Water Stewardship Council and its role in improving operations and sustainability and environmental impact.
Sure. I would say that 2020 was a really interesting year. Wow, what that silly statement, man, actually. 2020 this was not your grandfather's downturn. You know, this is something that I think it shook the industry in ways that it hasn't in the past. And one of the things that we have seen as an outcome of what happened last year, and as the industry is now contemplating how to do more with less, how to plan for growth in the future with a host of new and different scrutiny or sources of scrutiny, we've really seen collaboration as a really important sort of bedrock sort of element of how many companies are starting to approach their future. So we've had a long-term collaboration with a number of our customers. We have a customer advisory board that basically, advises. There isn't a single thing that we have released in our platforms and our new data over the last year that hasn't been informed directly by members of our community of users. But along the way, concerns about ESG, sustainability have been really at the forefront of a lot of conversations that we have with customers. And Rob actually has spent the better part of 18 months doing a really deep dive into the different sustainability frameworks, how the data are reported, what data are reported, and how it all gets used, how those data all get used around the sort of concept of ESG. And one of the things that we really became very, very apparent very quickly was the basic deficiency of that data for ESG reporting. So lack of consistency, lack of definitions, companies saying, well, my competitor just released recycling numbers that we think are physically impossible, and it makes us look bad because we've invested so much in infrastructure and capabilities, and we need to be able to understand this. Or I can't tell my story, even though I've made a multi-million-dollar investment in better operations, because there is no consistent definition or no consistent foundation for how those data flow into the different frameworks that are out there. And so what you have is an industry that is actually, there are some companies doing an incredible amount of work, making an incredible amount of investment in sustainability, in improving the quality of their operations, and they don't really have an adequate toolkit to actually share that with the world and have stakeholders like banks or investors actually understand it and contextualize it. And so that was really the basis for our newest program, which we just launched, called the Oilfield Water Stewardship Council. And the OWSC is really focused first on addressing some of the foundational elements of ESG as it relates to water in the oil field. There's been a ton of attention paid to greenhouse gases, people looking at carbon, even different companies looking at sort of equity in inside of companies and governance. What we are still seeing, though, is that water is sort of being shoehorned into frameworks that don't necessarily reflect the nuance that is important enough to make that, or that is needed, I should say, to make those data fundamentally usable. And so that's really why we started this council. Our two founding members are Eagle Claw, so an incredibly high quality midstream company, and Pioneer Natural Resources, which has been a driver of a lot of different sustainability initiatives, including a lot of really significant, I would say, risk-taking around reporting methane emissions and things like that. And we're very excited to launch this group and really start being able to drive this conversation forward in a way that is a lot more productive for the industry.
So it's always good to know that the industry is aware of its impact, which is, I think, that we've always been aware of our impact. So I guess a question that rises up from activists and others looking into our industry is, are we able to police ourselves by being transparent with our data. So we talked about the very large volumes of water, the difficulties of reusing it, and you also mentioned how good information makes for good decision making. So now you mentioned also understanding and being transparent about our environmental impact. So do you think that we are now stepping in the right direction then in terms of using the data that you have and the industry has in making better, transparent sort of reporting? Is that reliable? Can people trust this data?
So I'll speak to that quickly. And the issue of transparency is complex because one of the struggles that we face is being transparent with data. And I say we, I say that from an industry perspective, but also making sure that we are not inundating people with kind of information or with data, creating information overload where when everything is presented and disclosed, potentially nothing becomes important or actionable. So, I mean, one of our big efforts here, both internally and through our industry partners, is to ensure that we have the right data and associated metrics in place that result in companies making proper decisions. So, is that data actually decision useful? And then with regards to the quality of the data, yes, a lot of effort gets spent kind of matching organizational level data with data that comes from the asset level. So as the organization B3 is, we've become experts in managing this vast amount of data that kind of bubbles up from regulatory reporting or individual companies providing information and data about their operations. Consolidating that, aggregating, analyzing, and then trying to make a comparison between that data set and what companies report at the organizational level. And we see discrepancies. And it's not that necessarily one set of data is wrong versus another, or one interpretation is wrong versus another. But one of the issues that really seems to permeate is this lack of consistency in how the data actually gets treated and kind of represented to an audience. So, through our initiatives, through our products, through our industry associations, we are really trying to drive a more consistent and comparable approach around the data and the data derivatives that we derive or that we generate.
Thanks, Rob. I
would say, as we founded the Oilfield Water Stewardship Council, we realized that the most important thing that we can tackle right now is not, to Rob's point, is not amassing all of this data and trying to get companies to report as much as possible. It's much less glamorous. It's defining what is recycling. It's defining what is a midstream operator. What is a producer? What is a material metric for a midstream operator versus a producer? And until we have that sort of foundational work done to really allow people to contextualize data, those data are very, very hard to use. There's the risk of really, I would say, incidental findings in the data that are really detrimental to the industry and not necessarily, and it shouldn't be, because they're just used out of context. And that's where we really want to tackle that from the most basic starting spot and then be able to build on top of that. So we have the infrastructure and the architecture built and designed to be able to start collecting more data. We have different validation protocols that we've already started to architect. But until we have the real groundwork done, which is the less fun and less exciting, less glamorous, definition writing, none of it can really be useful to the industry.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. So that underlines that criticality of information for decision making. and allowing the industry, I guess, to take responsibility for its operations and its impacts. So sort of bring in one last question from the audience. It's on this topic. So Lana Pillsbury on YouTube, what regulatory requirements need to be met for produced water reuse? And I mean, do we know? I mean, do we have that information to hand? I mean, there are state regulations for sure, but given what you just said about what the Oilfield Water Stewardship Council is trying to achieve and how to understand data, can we arrive at a better set of regulations for our industry based on this activity in this direction?
I would say that the regulators aren't imposing requirements to qualify a barrel of water for reuse. Right now, the trend is overwhelmingly to find ways to incentivize, mostly with a stick right now, maybe with a carrot in the future, I don't know, water reuse and recycling. So, I think if you're thinking about it in a broader context of subsequent beneficial reuse of water, there's a whole host of safety thresholds, federal standards that will probably need to be established for certain constituents that exist in produced water before that can happen at scale. In places like the Permian, there are places in Wyoming where you have water that is discharged with minimal treatment because it's relatively clean when it comes out of the ground. But most of the regulatory push is towards recycling. What I would say is that when you think about data as it relates to the water life cycle, the regulators are a stakeholder that have suffered just as much as the industry from a lack of usable data. And so it is a really, it's imperative, because you always have the risk that there's going to be, a big draconian move, throw the baby out with the bathwater, to react in a knee-jerk way to things that are happening in the oil field. I mean, we have a ton of regulation or regulatory policy, I really should say, being directed at reduced seismicity. The science of that is not settled. We can't pinpoint the marginal barrel that may or may not actually create an earthquake. The more data that exists that are definitive in terms of not built by an interest group, not sort of commandeered by those sort of voices on either the anti-industry or the pure industry side of things, the more tools there are to actually have meaningful conversation, negotiate better regulatory outcomes.
Thanks, Kelly. Rob, do you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's just one simple comment, and that is the fact that it's a major gap in data collection and data provision right now with regards to what is being recycled, how much is being recycled, and kind of what the disposition is of that recycled product. In terms of just a more holistic understanding of the oil field water life cycle, we would like to know more from a data perspective. And again, that's why things like our Oil Field Water Stewardship Council and our industry relationships become very important, because we begin to kind of peel back the onion on what companies are doing with recycling, and hopefully get to the point someday where there is more disclosure around recycling operations, and there's a better understanding of how much water is ultimately being reused. So me personally would love to see that day come tomorrow, but again, I think we're evolving, and we're getting smarter and realize that more data around recycling is going to benefit both operators, regulatory agencies, and just kind of the broad stakeholder environment alike.
Thanks, Rob. So better data, better understanding, better decision-making, more intelligent produced water management, more sustainable produced water management. So excellent summary of what we've been talking about today. We're actually out of time, so Rob, Kelly, thank you very much for all your insight and comments and discussion on produced water management. It's been very, very interesting. Thank you to our audience for all their questions and comments that came in during the program. Once again, thank you everybody for participating in SPE Live. We'll be back next week, and wishing you all a very good day and rest of the week. So thank you. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And just a quick